So let's start by talking about opinions and puffs. We've spoken about puffs before. I've used this Red Bull Gives Me Wings one because I think it's like a really good example where we know it's there to induce somebody to think about a product or potentially purchase a product, but no reasonable person would really assume that drinking that product resulted in you being able to fly. What about kids? Yeah, well, it's not a necessary and they don't have capacity. It's funny actually, when my kids were small, they used to take things out of advertising absolutely seriously. But again, didn't have capacity, didn't have their own money. Puffs exaggerate the qualities of the subject and they're not intended to be taken seriously. There isn't a promissory intent. So puffs are pretty easy. Nobody is really expecting, other than perhaps the kids who don't have capacity to contract anyway, nobody is really expecting that this is a promise that will be kept. But what about an opinion? Any of you recognise where this is taken? Over in Williamstown. I like it when the cases are something close to home. I used to live near here. JJ Savage, I like JJ Savage, it's a nice case. So Mr. Blakney wanted to buy a speedboat and he went to JJ Savage. And in fact, I think he sent a couple of faxes. Maybe not faxes, can't remember how long ago it was actually. But there were some communications. And he wanted to be able to go pretty fast. So he asked about the different capabilities of different engines that could be fitted. And he got some communications back and he was told that there were 3 different options, and depending on whatever different motors were chosen, he was given the estimated speeds that this boat would be able to go. So he chose one of those engines and he bought the boat and he's got a delivery of it and it only goes 12 miles an hour. So he is not a happy camper, and he must have been a really unhappy camper actually, because this ended up at the High Court over a speedboat. What can we say? And so the question that actually sat in front of Justices, or Chief Justice Barwick and Justices Kitto, Menzies, Owen and Walsh, was whether the statements that related to how fast the boat would go if a particular engine was fitted were representations that form part of the contract or whether they were statements of opinion. Has anybody had a look at the case? Sarah, what did they say?
That because the statement was an estimate, it wasn't meant to be a binding statement.
Absolutely. So they said because they were asked for an opinion, and the opinion that they gave was couched with this language around the estimate, that it wasn't a promise that it would go that fast, it was an estimate that it might go somewhere near that fast. He took it to the High Court. Obviously, he was just as upset with this as you were. So basically, the court said an estimate is not the same as a contractual term. So looking at the language in the case, it does come down to looking at the language. So what did, this is Chief Justice Barwick's judgment from memory. So far from being a promissory expression, estimated speed 15 miles an hour indicates an expression of opinion as the result of approximate calculation based on probability, to use the dictionary equivalent of estimate, and as a consequence, not a contractual term. So what do we get out of this case? other than it's kind of nice to know that there are cases decided that are nice and close to home. Looking at the language, the use of that word estimate was of fundamental importance. So let's move on and look at some of the differences between terms and representations in a broader sense. Sorry, Chef.
It's all right, I was just going to add to that. Telstra does that with all its broadband plans.
Exactly. And actually it's a really great example because Telstra's not the only phone carrier that does it. In fact, the NBN's doing it now as well. Results may vary. Have learned from cases like this. So this is where the lovers learn from the hard work that the fighters do for us. They couch the language in the contracts in very broad terms. So I know, half the reason I'm in here as often as I am is because I've got really, really crappy internet out where I live. And I'll ring Telstra and they tell me that as long as I'm getting more than 2 megabits a second, it's within the confines of my contract. Thinking, yeah, if I paid you $2 a month instead of 100, that would be within the confines of my contract too, but I don't get away with it. So part of what we need to be able to do is recognise a representation in the wild, be able to see the difference between an opinion or a statement of fact or something to induce you to have a conversation and something that has some sort of promissory intent. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember. The idea of a promissory statement is that the promissory statement needs to be made with a view to inducing somebody into the contract. It forms ultimately part of what the offer is. And we spoke last week about identifying essential terms as being the terms without which a party wouldn't enter into the contract. In order to be a term, a representation needs to be made in a way that was intended to be relied upon. But even so, a representation only becomes a term of the contract if that in fact is what the parties agree. So representations sit on that borderline. They might be terms of the contract, they might not be terms of the contract. So talking about the capabilities of something, expressing an opinion about something, talking about a range of quality that something might sit within, if you want that to be a term of your contract, you need to be very clear when you're writing the contract that that is what you want to achieve. So I'll give you some examples I think is better. In order to distinguish the difference between a term and a mere representation, we need to see that a term is something that includes a promise, is intended to be binding, not just to induce entry into the contract, but to be binding. It needs to go to either a right or an obligation of the parties, and ultimately there needs to be a consequence if it's breached.